Tonight's story is about the night the Western Roman Empire truly collapsed. The night a civilization that had stood for more than 1,000 years finally faced a moment it could not escape. Rome, the eternal city, the unmatched capital of the ancient world, was about to be shaken by events that would echo through history. You are about to hear the full, calm, immersive retelling of that night and everything that led to it, from Rome's rise to its final breath as an empire. Before we begin, take a moment to relax your shoulders, soften your breath, and settle into whatever space brings you comfort. If you enjoy journeys like this, peaceful, long-form stories that help you unwind, sleep, or simply drift through history, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment about what story you'd like to hear next. Now let the outside world fade, and let us walk quietly into the last moments of ancient Rome. The city of Rome, on the evening before its fall, was wrapped in a peaceful glow that hardly hinted at the danger pressing in from beyond its gates. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, warm light washed over the city's ancient rooftops, and the long shadows of temples and arches stretched across the stone streets. Shopkeepers were closing their stalls for the night, sweeping dust from the ground, folding fabrics, and extinguishing small lamps that had guided customers throughout the day. Families inside their homes prepared simple meals of bread, olives, and watered wine, whispering to one another in soft voices as the sound of fountains trickled through open windows. It was an evening that looked and felt like countless evenings before it, filled with small routines that made life feel stable, predictable, even eternal. Yet beneath this calm surface, there was a tension that only a few in the city could sense, a heaviness in the air, a kind of waiting. For weeks, the Visigoth army led by the warrior King Alaric had camped around Rome, cutting off supplies, demanding negotiations, and applying pressure that many Romans believed would eventually be resolved through diplomacy, as it always had been before. Rome had been besieged in earlier years, but the city had never fallen. There was an unspoken belief, almost a superstition, that Rome itself was protected by destiny, by tradition, or by its gods. Even in difficult times, the idea that the city could be taken felt impossible. To understand why this night mattered so deeply, why it shook the entire Western world, we must look back, farther back, to the beginning, when Rome was nothing more than a small settlement beside the Tiber River. Imagine that early world: wooden huts with thatched roofs, muddy paths instead of paved streets, farmers tending small plots of land, shepherds guiding their flocks under the same sun that would one day shine on a vast empire. The story of Rome began with struggle, with survival, with ambition. Legends tell of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, who would go on to shape the destiny of the city. Whether imagined or real, these stories captured the spirit of Rome, fierce, persistent, and driven by fate. Over centuries, the tiny settlement grew into a kingdom, then into a proud republic governed by councils and elected officials, and from that republic emerged an empire whose legions marched across continents. Roman soldiers built roads that connected distant lands. Engineers constructed aqueducts that carried fresh water from the mountains. Philosophers debated politics, justice, and morality. Poets wrote stories and songs that filled libraries and theaters. Under Julius Caesar, the old political order cracked, giving way to a new imperial system, and under Augustus, the first emperor, Rome entered its golden age, the Pax Romana, a period of peace and prosperity unmatched in the ancient world. For generations, Rome's legions guarded its borders, extending its influence from the deserts of Africa to the cold forests of northern Europe. The empire became a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions, all connected by Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman power. Cities flourished, trade expanded, ideas flowed freely, and people across the Mediterranean came to believe that Rome was not just a place but a force of nature, as permanent as mountains or oceans. But as centuries passed, the foundations of this vast structure began to weaken. The empire grew difficult to govern, its population strained by taxes and hunger, its leaders corrupted by ambition and greed. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, many assassinated, many incompetent, each leaving the empire more fractured than before. Civil wars erupted, draining resources and destroying unity. The economy faltered, inflation soared, trade routes became dangerous. And at the borders, Germanic tribes pressed in, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, but always as reminders that Rome's strength was no longer what it once had been. The Visigoths, one such tribe, had a long and complicated relationship with Rome. Years earlier, they had crossed into Roman territory seeking refuge from the Huns, only to be mistreated, starved, and exploited by Roman officials. Their suffering erupted into rebellion, leading to the devastating Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where a Roman emperor fell and an entire Roman army was crushed. Though peace was eventually restored, the distrust between Goths and Romans never fully healed. Alaric, the man who would one day stand at Rome's gates, had fought for Rome as a young soldier, learning the empire's tactics, politics, and weaknesses. Yet he and his people remained outsiders, denied land, denied payment, denied the respect they believed they had earned. Alaric rose as a leader determined to secure a permanent homeland for his people, believing that Rome owed the Visigoths not only justice but survival itself. When the empire refused to meet his demands, when promises were broken and negotiations stalled, he made a decision. If Rome would not treat his people fairly, then Rome would feel the pressure of a siege. So for weeks, the Visigoths camped around the city, waiting. Inside Rome, the effects were devastating. Supplies dwindled, hunger spread, families bartered whatever they had left, the wealthy bickered over how much gold they should surrender to buy peace. Negotiators went out and returned with little progress. Rumors circulated through the crowded streets. Some believed the emperor would send reinforcements, others believed the gods were punishing the city, and many whispered that Rome had lost its strength long before this siege began. But even in this uncertainty, Rome tried to maintain an image of normalcy. The baths remained open, though fewer people visited. Markets operated, though goods were scarce. Guards still patrolled the walls, though their armor hung loosely on bodies thinned by hunger. At night, lamps flickered in the windows of villas and apartments alike, casting warm light that made the city appear peaceful, almost serene. It was a dangerous illusion. 3 days before the final night, negotiations reached a critical point. Senators met with Alaric, offering gold and grain in exchange for lifting the siege. Alaric accepted some terms but grew frustrated when the city hesitated to fulfill others. He had seen Rome stall before. He knew waiting only strengthened their resolve. After the third meeting ended in failure, he tightened the noose around the city. No supplies in, no people out. Inside Rome, fear settled like fog. Bread became scarce. Livestock vanished from the markets. People resorted to boiling weeds, leaves, even leather straps to make something resembling food. Temples grew crowded as people sought guidance from gods who had been silent for years. Children cried from hunger, and parents could do nothing except whisper promises they knew were empty. The wealthy retreated behind thick walls. The poor slept in streets and alleyways praying for dawn. And then came the night. It began quietly like so many nights before it. Lamps flickered, fountains trickled. The moon cast pale light over rooftops and the empty forum. But somewhere near the northern wall at the Salarian gate, a decision was made that would change history. Whether driven by desperation, betrayal, or hope for survival, someone opened the gate from the inside. Slowly, quietly, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and the Visigoth warriors, waiting in darkness, advanced. They entered Rome not with roaring battle cries, but with the disciplined silence of soldiers who understood the weight of the moment. Rome, the eternal city, was open before them. They entered quietly, their boots pressing against the ancient stones with a slow, steady rhythm that seemed almost respectful, as though even these hardened warriors understood the gravity of what they were stepping into. The moon overhead glinted off iron helmets and long spears held upright in disciplined formation. Rome had been conquered before, centuries earlier by the Gauls, but no one alive in this moment had seen the city vulnerable. No one had imagined this sight. Foreign soldiers flooding through its gates without a fight. The few Roman guards who remained at their posts backed away, not out of cowardice, but out of shock and disbelief. For generations, they had been told the walls of Rome would never fall. Tonight those walls stood, but Rome itself did not. As the Visigoths moved deeper inside, the sounds of the sleeping city mixed with new sounds. Armor softly clinking whispered commands. The low rumble of horses led through narrow streets. The soldiers fanned out methodically, not rushing, not scattering wildly, but advancing with the certainty of men who had waited a long time for this moment. Some carried torches, others carried nothing but weapons and an unspoken determination. They passed by bakeries, temples, and homes whose occupants stirred awake to the unfamiliar noises. Soft cries broke the silence from behind shutters or half-open doors, as families realized that whatever protection they once believed in had failed. A woman in a modest home near the Forum woke to the distant thud of boots. She shook her husband awake, her voice trembling, and they both listened as the unmistakable sound of soldiers approached. They gathered their 2 children and retreated to a small storage room at the back of their home, huddling together in fear. Through the cracks in the wall, they saw torchlights sweep across the street. They heard the muffled voices of the Visigoths as they moved past their door. Each second stretched like an hour, and though no one attempted to break into their home, the uncertainty, the knowledge that the city was no longer theirs, cut deeper than any blade. Across the city, in a grand villa belonging to an aging senator, servants scrambled to gather valuables, stuffing silver plates, jewelry, and scrolls into bags. The senator himself stood in his atrium, trembling as he stared at a statue of Jupiter that had been passed down through generations. He whispered a prayer to a god he feared had already abandoned them. The sounds of chaos grew outside his walls, and he knew that the life he had lived, the power he once held, the voice he once commanded, meant nothing now. Rome had protected him all his life. What would protect him now? As the Visigoths advanced, fires ignited in different parts of the city. Some began as deliberate acts, flames set into wooden structures as warnings, as symbols of conquest. Others erupted from overturned lamps or accidents caused in the confusion of the night. The flames climbed quickly, licking the edges of rooftops and sending sparks drifting into the sky like fireflies. Smoke rose in thick columns, casting a reddish glow across the city as the light reflected off marble statues and bronze doors. The night was no longer quiet. It throbbed with a low roar as though the city itself were crying out. Yet amid the destruction, there were moments of restraint. Warriors, following Alaric's orders, avoided unnecessary slaughter. Some Romans who feared for their lives discovered that the invaders spared them if they remained calm. A group of monks in a small church sang hymns, their voices trembling as Visigoth riders passed outside without entering. A young boy, separated from his parents in the confusion, wandered through the streets sobbing, only to be found by a Visigoth soldier who, despite the chaos around him, lifted the child onto his horse and carried him toward a group of families who were being allowed to gather safely in an open courtyard. Still, many were not spared. Wealth drew danger. Villas belonging to the richest families became scenes of panic as soldiers broke down gates and seized gold, silver, and fine fabrics. The wealthy fled or hid, some in underground wine cellars, others in private shrines. But even wealth could not stop the flames beginning to inch closer. Houses that had stood proud for generations cracked under the heat, their wooden beams giving way with loud groans that echoed through the streets. Statues toppled, their marble faces shattering against stone. Libraries filled with scrolls, histories, poems, knowledge collected over centuries, crumbled into ash. At the center of the city, near the Forum, an old librarian named Marcus stood before the entrance of his beloved library, watching as embers drifted down onto its roof. His heart ached with a pain far deeper than fear. Inside that building were the works of writers he had admired all his life: Livy, Cicero, Virgil, Ovid. He knew that knowledge could be rebuilt, that ideas could survive, but he also knew that some of the scrolls within those walls were the last copies in existence. As flames began to spread toward the library, Marcus made a decision. He ran inside, gathering as many scrolls as he could carry in his arms. He stumbled back out just as part of the roof collapsed behind him, carrying with it centuries of learning that no one would ever read again. Marcus fell to his knees, the saved scrolls scattered around him, tears falling onto the dusty ground. Rome was burning, and with it, pieces of humanity's memory were turning to smoke. Meanwhile, Alaric himself rode calmly through the northern gate, entering the city he had spent his life fighting against and fighting for. His expression was not triumphant. He did not raise his sword or call out commands with excitement. Instead, he looked around with a quiet, somber understanding. He had wanted justice for his people. He had wanted a homeland. He had wanted Rome to keep its promises. But he had never wanted this: the destruction, the terror, the cries of families who had done nothing to wrong him. War demanded action, but it often delivered sorrow. Alaric felt the weight of that truth heavy on his shoulders. He guided his horse through the dimly lit streets, passing small homes, burned marketplaces, and the grand arches that had once celebrated Rome's victories. He thought of the battles he had fought at Rome's side as a younger man. He thought of the betrayal his people endured. He thought of the long journey that had led him to this moment. One of his commanders rode beside him, asking whether they should push deeper into the city. Alaric shook his head, his voice low and steady. "Do only what is necessary," he said, "no more." The city, however, was far too large, far too chaotic for even Alaric to control completely. Fires spread unpredictably. Soldiers broke ranks. Panic escalated. In some quarters, Romans abandoned their homes entirely, flooding into streets already crowded with fleeing families. People cried out for loved ones who had disappeared into the confusion. Looters, both Visigoth and Roman, took advantage of the chaos, seizing anything they could carry. Dogs barked wildly. Horses reared. The crackling of flames grew louder, mixing with the faint sounds of collapsing structures. A young Roman soldier named Lucius, barely 20 years old, staggered through a smoky alley, clutching a broken spear. He had been stationed at the Salarian gate when it opened. He had watched the Visigoths pour in. He had tried to hold his ground but was quickly overwhelmed. Now he wandered through the maze of streets, coughing from the smoke, trying to find his family's home. When he reached it, an unassuming apartment above a small shop, he found the door open and the rooms empty. His mother's favorite vase lay shattered on the floor. His sister's sandals were missing from their usual place near the door. He called out their names, but no answer came. In that moment, Lucius felt the weight of Rome's fall not as a historical event, but as a personal heartbreak. He sank onto a stool, burying his face in his hands. For him, the empire had not fallen because Visigoths entered the city. It had fallen because everything he loved was gone. As the hours passed, the night deepened. Fires spread. Families hid. Soldiers roamed. Rome, the great and mighty capital that had once dictated the fate of the world, was reduced to a patchwork of fear, courage, loss, and survival. You could walk from one street where chaos raged to another where absolute silence held. You could see a villa burning on one side of the road while, on the other, a small shrine glowed peacefully beneath a lantern, untouched by violence. You could see warriors searching for treasure, and just steps away, a Roman father comforting his child, singing softly to drown out the screams beyond their door. In the distance, the massive outline of the Colosseum loomed in the moonlight, its dark archways glowing faintly from reflected firelight. Once a place of grand spectacle, gladiators, exotic animals, cheering crowds, it now stood silent, a witness to the transformation of the city. The stones of Rome had absorbed centuries of triumph and tragedy, but tonight they absorbed something different, the end of an era. As dawn approached, the fires began to die down, leaving behind charred ruins and smoldering beams. Ash drifted gently through the air like snow, settling onto rooftops, statues, and the bodies of exhausted survivors. Rome was alive, but it was changed, forever changed. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Rome lay beneath a veil of gray smoke, the rising sun struggling to pierce through the haze left by the night's destruction. The city that had once awakened to the lively chatter of markets and the clatter of merchants setting up their stalls now stirred with cautious whispers and the soft shuffle of hesitant footsteps. People emerged from their hiding places slowly, as if unsure whether morning truly signaled safety. The air smelled of ash, sharp, dry, and heavy, and the once bright marble of temples and arches appeared muted beneath layers of soot. It felt as if all color had been drained from the world during the night, leaving only shadows and memories behind. In the early light, survivors began to gather in small clusters, exchanging stories in hushed tones. Some spoke of homes lost to fire, others of loved ones missing. Many simply stared blankly at the ruins around them, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. A group of women knelt beside a fountain whose water now ran murky with ash, washing their faces with trembling hands. An elderly man wandered through the street in slow circles, calling out the name of his wife, who had been separated from him in the chaos. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide with confusion and lingering fear. In one corner of the city, near the Temple of Vesta, a group of Vestal virgins stood in a solemn circle. The sacred flame, the flame that had symbolized the life of Rome, had gone out sometime during the night. Some believed this was the ultimate sign that the empire had truly fallen, for the flame had been tended continuously for centuries. Now the ashes sat cold in the ancient brazier. The Vestals looked upon it with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance, understanding that some chapters in history close not with ceremony but with quiet extinguishing. Not far away, Alaric himself stood on the steps of a damaged basilica, speaking softly with his commanders. His expression was distant, contemplative. While the night had brought destruction, it had also brought pressure to organize his people, protect them from starvation, and decide what to do next. The Visigoths had not come merely to burn Rome. They needed supplies, wealth, and leverage. Alaric listened to the reports, where fires had spread, where his people had seized grain, where Roman resistance had emerged in small pockets. He nodded quietly as he absorbed the information, each detail weighing on him. What he had achieved was monumental, but it did not bring him the satisfaction a conqueror might be expected to feel. Instead, it filled him with a heavy awareness that history would forever remember this moment, not as a triumph, but as the day an empire was broken. A soft wind began to blow, carrying away some of the lingering smoke. As it drifted through the city, it passed through the tall columns of the Forum, rustling the tattered banners that still hung from the Senate House. One by one, survivors gathered there, drawn to the familiar center of Roman life. Senators in torn robes, shopkeepers covered in soot, soldiers whose armor was dented and scorched. They all came, standing in silence among the ruins of the place where laws had once been created and the affairs of the empire discussed. Their faces bore the same bewildered realization that the Rome they had always known had ceased to exist. Among them stood a young woman named Livia, who worked as a scribe for one of the senators. Her usually neat hair was tangled with ash, and her ink-stained hands trembled as she clutched a satchel containing the documents she had saved from her workplace. She looked around at the broken columns and shattered statues and felt a strange mixture of grief and responsibility. She had spent her life copying laws, letters, and speeches, preserving the words of Rome. Now, those words felt more precious than ever. She wondered whether the future would remember what Rome once tried to be, or only how it had fallen. Just beyond the Forum, Lucius, the young soldier who had spent the night searching for his family, made his way through the crowd, his eyes scanning every face with desperate hope. He had wandered the burned streets all morning, calling out names, offering coins for information, even questioning Visigoth soldiers. But every answer was the same. They had not seen his family. The uncertainty gnawed at him. In his mind, he replayed their last moments together, his mother preparing dinner by the window, his sister laughing at something he had said, his father telling him to be brave. He clung to those memories, refusing to let them fade into fear. When he saw a small group of survivors gathered near the remains of a collapsed building, he rushed toward them, his heart pounding. But they were not his family. He turned away, tears blurring his vision. Elsewhere in the city, Marcus, the elderly librarian who had saved what scrolls he could, sat against a column in the shade of a half-collapsed portico. The scrolls he had rescued lay beside him, their edges singed but intact. He took one and slowly unrolled it, running his fingers across the familiar ink. It was a work he had copied in his youth, the words of a philosopher reflecting on the nature of impermanence. "All is change," the text began. "Nothing stays still." Marcus read the line again and again as if trying to convince himself that this loss was part of a greater cycle. But as he looked at the damaged library in the distance, his chest tightened. The idea of rebuilding felt impossible. The weight of what had been lost, knowledge, history, voices from the past, pressed on him like a stone. Mid-morning brought a new sight, groups of Romans and Visigoths interacting without violence. Some Romans offered water to thirsty Visigoth children. Others approached the warriors cautiously, asking about missing relatives. In a strange way, necessity created brief moments of cooperation. Alaric had ordered his men to avoid wanton killing, and this allowed pockets of humanity to form amidst the ruins. A Roman baker named Publius approached a group of Visigoths with a basket of stale bread he had found in his ruined shop. He offered it to them, and they accepted with gratitude. One of the warriors handed him a small pouch of grain in return, a silent acknowledgement of shared survival. Yet despite these small gestures, the tension remained thick. Many Romans whispered that the gods had punished them for abandoning their old traditions. Others believed Rome's leaders had failed them with years of corruption and incompetence. The Christian clergy preached that this was a test, a trial that would lead to spiritual renewal. Everyone searched for meaning, for a reason that explained how the eternal city could have fallen so swiftly. As the morning stretched into midday, the sun warmed the smoke-filled air, casting long beams of light between broken walls and charred beams. A group of musicians emerged near the Tiber River, carrying instruments that had survived the night. They sat on the riverbank and began to play a soft, solemn melody. The notes drifted across the water, mingling with the gentle movement of the river. Some people paused to listen, closing their eyes as music replaced fear, if only for a moment. It was a reminder that even in the aftermath of destruction, beauty could still exist. Across the river, Alaric watched the musicians from a distance. The sound reached him faintly, almost like a memory of a world he had never belonged to but had always admired. He thought about what to do next. His people needed food, safety, and shelter. Rome alone could not provide all of that. He had won his victory, but he knew they could not remain in the city forever. He would have to lead his people onward, find a place where they could settle, rebuild, and finally rest after years of wandering. As he stood by the riverbank, one of his lieutenants approached him, asking about their next move. Alaric looked out at the city, its proud monuments battered, its people grieving, and felt the burden of leadership press against his ribs like a tightening band. "We take what we need," he said quietly, "and then we leave them in peace." It was a promise, not only to his people but to himself. The lieutenant nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind the words. They had made their point. They had taken the treasure they demanded. They had found justice after years of betrayal. There was no need for further cruelty. The lieutenant returned to his men, relaying the order, and slowly, throughout the afternoon, the Visigoths began to gather their supplies and prepare for departure. But Rome was not ready to move on. The emotional shock lingered in the streets like the smoke still clinging to scorched rooftops. Survivors revisited the ruins of their homes, searching for anything that could be salvaged: clothes, heirlooms, family records. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to decide where to go or what to do. Even the city's leaders seemed paralyzed, unsure how to govern a place that had lost not only its wealth but its confidence. As afternoon turned into evening, the rays of the setting sun filtered through the smoky air, painting the city in shades of orange and gold once more. This time, however, the glow felt different, warmer in some places, harsher in others, a reminder that even beauty could emerge from ruin. Survivors sat together in small groups, sharing what food they could find. Children clung to their parents, asking questions with wide, uncertain eyes. Roman soldiers who had once marched proudly now sat with their helmets removed, staring at the ground as if trying to understand their new reality. High above the city, near the remains of the northern wall, the watchman who had sensed danger the night before stood silently, leaning on his spear. He had watched the Visigoths enter. He had watched the fires spread. He had watched the morning reveal a wounded city. Now, as the sky darkened again, he looked out over Rome with tired eyes. It still stood. It had not been erased, but it had been humbled, its pride stripped away, its illusions shattered. The city he had sworn to protect had been changed forever, and he knew that nothing in his lifetime would restore it to what it had been. And yet, in a strange and quiet way, life began to return to the city. People swept debris from their doorways. Priests restored fallen statues. Children played with sticks in the dirt, pretending to be soldiers or heroes, unaware of the depth of the tragedy they had survived. Rome was wounded but alive, broken but breathing. For now, that was enough. As night returned to Rome for the first time since the city had been breached, the surviving citizens faced it with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and reluctant acceptance. The fires from the previous night no longer raged, but pockets of embers still glowed red in the ruins, emitting soft crackles and faint plumes of smoke that drifted upward into the cooling air. The sky above was clear, and stars emerged slowly one by one, as if unsure whether they should shine over a city that had just witnessed such trauma. The moon hung low, casting pale light across streets littered with broken pottery, fallen beams, and abandoned weapons. It was a quiet night, far quieter than the last, but the silence felt heavy, as though the city itself was too tired to speak. A small group of Romans gathered near the remnants of the Forum, sitting close together for warmth. Among them was Livia, the scribe who had saved her satchel of documents. She held the stack tightly against her chest, as if afraid that letting it go might mean letting go of the world she once knew. Around her, other survivors whispered in low voices, recounting where they had hidden during the attack, wondering which senators or officials were still alive, and speculating about what the Visigoths planned to do next. Some believed the warriors would leave soon, taking their plunder with them. Others feared they would return in greater force, or that other tribes, hearing of Rome's weakness, would descend upon the city like wolves drawn to a wounded animal. No one knew the future, and uncertainty clung to them like a cold mist. Nearby, Lucius, the young soldier who had spent the morning searching for his missing family, sat alone on the steps of a damaged temple. He stared blankly at the cracked stone beneath his feet, unable to find the energy to move. He had searched every familiar street, every alley, every courtyard he knew his family might have fled to. He had spoken to dozens of survivors, some kind, some terrified, some barely coherent, but none had seen his mother, father, or sister. The weight of not knowing pressed on his chest until his breaths felt shallow. He replayed memories in his mind, helping his mother carry a basket from the market, teaching his sister how to tie the straps of her sandals, listening to his father tell stories about Rome's greatness. Those memories now felt like relics of a world that had vanished. Lucius did not cry. He simply sat in numb stillness, waiting for his heart to accept what his mind refused to believe. Across the city, Marcus the librarian had taken refuge in a courtyard not far from the smoldering remains of his library. He had arranged the scrolls he saved into a neat stack beside him and lay on the ground looking up at the stars. The constellations he had studied since he was a boy spread across the sky, unchanged, steady, eternal. He took comfort in their familiarity, in the knowledge that even as Rome faltered, the universe remained constant. He traced the patterns with his eyes, whispering the names of the figures they represented: Jupiter towering above, Mars gleaming red, Venus soft and gentle in the distance. The night air felt cool against his skin, and for the first time since the siege began, he allowed himself to close his eyes. "We will rebuild what we can," he murmured, "and what we cannot rebuild, we will remember." His voice trembled slightly. That is what it means to endure. At the same time, the Visigoths who remained within the city spent the evening reorganizing their camp and preparing the supplies they had gathered. Many of them, like the Romans, were exhausted from the previous night's events. They too felt the weight of the destruction, not as victors celebrating triumph, but as people who had endured years of hardship, hunger, and betrayal. Some of the Gothic warriors sat beside Roman fountains, washing their hands and faces in the cool water. Others tended to their wounded or shared portions of grain they had secured. A few even exchanged quiet words with Romans who approached them cautiously, asking about lost relatives or begging for mercy. The interactions were not warm, but they were not violent either. They were the interactions of two peoples forced into proximity by history's shifting tides. Alaric himself walked through the city once more as the stars grew brighter. This time, he traveled alone, without commanders or guards beside him. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone streets as he surveyed the aftermath of the sack. He observed the burned-out shells of villas, the scattered debris in the forum, the charred remains of market stalls. His face remained steady, but his eyes revealed a complicated tangle of emotions: weariness, sorrow, disappointment, and an undercurrent of determination. He had not come to Rome seeking senseless destruction. He had come seeking recognition, justice, and a homeland for his people. But Rome had refused him so many times that force had become the only language left between them. He paused near the steps of the Senate House and looked up at the once grand structure. The bronze doors were blackened by smoke, and cracks ran across the marble facade. He imagined the debates that had taken place within those walls, debates that had shaped the destiny of millions across the empire. Now those debates felt hollow, their outcomes rendered meaningless by the reality of Rome's fall. Alaric knew the world had changed. He also knew he had played a role in changing it. The burden of that truth pressed upon him, and he exhaled slowly, as though trying to release a weight that refused to lift. Down by the riverbank, a group of refugees who had fled their homes during the chaos sat wrapped in blankets, staring into small fires they had built for warmth. Among them was a woman holding an infant tightly to her chest, rocking the child slowly back and forth. Her eyes were red from crying, but her movements were steady, instinctive. A man beside her whispered stories of Rome's past triumphs, trying to bring comfort to those around him. "We survived the Gauls once," he murmured. "We will survive this too." A few people nodded weakly, clinging to the hope in his words, even if they doubted them in their hearts. The watchman, who had sensed the strange tension before the fall, returned to his post at the northern wall. He leaned against the rough surface, gazing out over the quiet plain beyond the city. The Visigoth campfires glowed faintly in the distance, scattered like stars fallen to the earth. He watched them silently for a long time, lost in thought. When he turned back toward the city, he saw Rome stretch beneath him, dark in some places, glowing dimly in others, its familiar shape altered but still recognizable. He whispered to himself, "She still stands." The words were soft, almost reverent. And in that whisper there was both grief and pride. As the night grew deeper, a peaceful stillness began to settle over Rome. The crying had quieted. The fires were dying. The frantic energy of survival had given way to a heavy, shared exhaustion. People lay down wherever they could, in courtyards, on temple steps, beside their ruined homes, and sleep came upon them like a gentle, necessary mercy. Even those who could not sleep fully, like Lucius, who kept waking to listen for the voices of his family, found their minds drifting in and out of quiet, dreamlike states. In these moments between wakefulness and rest, the city felt suspended in time, caught between its past glory and its uncertain future. Far above the sleeping city, stars shimmered more brightly than they had earlier, as if the darkness below made their light stand out more clearly. They looked down on Rome not with judgment, but with the detached serenity of distant observers. They had seen civilizations rise and fall for thousands of years. Now they witnessed Rome joining that ancient cycle. And perhaps in their steady, silent glow, there was a reminder that even as one story ends, another quietly begins. At first light, a soft gray dawn spread across Rome, lifting the darkness and revealing the full extent of what had happened. The smoke that had hung over the city through the night began to thin, rising into the pale morning sky like a final sigh from the ruins below. The sunlight that filtered through the ash-choked air was muted and hazy, casting a gentle, almost dreamlike glow over the broken rooftops and charred remains of once proud buildings. Survivors stepped out of their makeshift beds, some having slept on bare stone, others on what little bedding they had salvaged, and stood quietly as they took in the scene. Rome had survived the night, but it was no longer the Rome they had known. It felt smaller, quieter, strangely fragile. In the forum, a group of senators gathered once again, though their appearance now bore little resemblance to the dignified officials they had been only days earlier. Their robes were torn and stained, their faces drawn and weary. They spoke in hushed tones, not with the confident authority of leaders, but with the subdued heaviness of people who did not know what the next hours would bring. The Senate House behind them loomed like an ancient ghost, its once magnificent facade now cracked and blackened by smoke. A few senators suggested organizing aid for the wounded. Others spoke of sending a message to the emperor, if there still was an emperor capable of helping, and some simply stared ahead in silence, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. A short distance away, Livia knelt beside a damaged column, unrolling the documents she had saved during the chaos. She wiped ash from the edges of the parchment and examined each one carefully. Some were official decrees, others were letters. A few were fragments of speeches delivered by senators long dead. As she worked, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the ink beneath her fingers or the small sense of purpose that came from preserving something that had survived the night. She knew these documents could not rebuild Rome, but they could keep its voice alive. And that, she thought, was a kind of victory. Near the entrance to a nearby temple, Marcus the librarian sat with the scrolls he had saved, arranging them in careful stacks. As survivors passed by, some paused to watch him, drawn to his quiet dedication. A few offered to help, though they admitted they had no experience with long scrolls or delicate parchment. Marcus smiled gently and guided them, showing them how to hold the edges, how to weigh down the corners with small stones, how to brush away ash without smearing the ink. In those simple actions, community began to take shape again. People who had been strangers before the sack now found themselves united by shared loss and the shared desire to salvage whatever fragments of their culture they could. Lucius, still unable to find his family, wandered further from the forum than he had ventured the day before. His steps were slow, his body aching from exhaustion, but he pushed on, driven by the faint hope that perhaps they had sought refuge outside the immediate center of the city. He passed neighborhoods he had rarely visited before, seeing the destruction spread over a wider area than he had realized. Homes collapsed, streets buried under debris, small shops looted or burned. He called out their names again and again, his voice growing hoarse. Each unanswered call made his heart sink deeper, yet he refused to stop searching. He could not let go, not yet. As the morning progressed, more Visigoths gathered near the gates, preparing for their eventual departure. Some repaired their weapons, others counted the supplies they had taken, and a few sat quietly, gazing out at the city with a mix of curiosity and contemplation. They had seen Rome as a distant idea, a place spoken about by traders and travelers, a place whispered about by mothers raising children in huts far from marble walls. Now they stood within it, surrounded by its grandeur and its ruin. Many of them felt a strange sense of awe, not for the destruction they had helped bring, but for the city itself, whose strength and spirit had shaped the world long before they were born. Alaric spent the morning riding through the city once again, this time with several commanders at his side. They discussed logistics, how much grain had been taken, how their people would move, where they would camp next. But each time Alaric paused to look at the ruins, the commanders fell silent, recognizing that their leader was not merely planning their departure. He was absorbing the significance of what they had done. Rome had fallen not through years of conquest, not through a final great battle, but through desperation, neglect, pride, and the slow decay of an empire that had once believed itself eternal. Alaric knew he would be remembered, but he wondered how history would judge him. As a barbarian, a liberator, a destroyer. He did not know, and he suspected he never would. As midday approached, the sun grew brighter, warming the cool air left from the night. The light reflected off the remaining pieces of marble and bronze, casting shimmering patterns across the stones. People began clearing streets, not out of obedience to any leader but out of necessity. Pathways needed to be navigable. Fires needed to be extinguished fully. Survivors needed places to gather. A group of Roman soldiers, those who had not fled or fallen, set aside their weapons, and began helping civilians move broken beams away from doorways. Others carried buckets of water to douse smoldering fires. In moments like these, the divisions between class, wealth, and rank, once so rigid in Roman society, began to soften. Down by the river, a group of fishermen had gathered to check the state of their boats. Some found them damaged by falling debris, others found them untouched. As they inspected the hulls, they spoke quietly about what would come next. The Tiber remained the lifeline of the city, and even in these dark times it promised food, trade, and connection to the outside world. One fisherman, an older man with weathered hands, dipped his fingers into the cool water and said, "Rome has fallen, but the river still flows. That must mean something." His companions nodded, finding comfort in the simplicity of the observation. On the outskirts of the city, near the northern gate, a small group of Visigoth women and children sat in a cluster, eating what little food they had set aside. They had traveled with the warriors for months, through storms, hunger, and danger. Now, as they rested within the walls of Rome, they saw the city through different eyes. Some marveled at the towering arches and immense structures, so different from the wooden huts and rolling fields of their homeland. Others looked at the sorrow in the eyes of the Romans and felt a quiet empathy, understanding that loss was universal. A young Visigoth mother held her baby close and whispered, "We will move on soon. We will find a place where you can grow without fear." Her voice carried the weary hope of someone who had endured too much for far too long. The wind shifted again in the afternoon, bringing with it the familiar scent of herbs from a nearby garden that had somehow survived the flames. The fragrance drifted through the streets, offering a moment of comfort to those who smelled it. Small details like this, a scent, a memory, a familiar sound, became anchors for the people of Rome, grounding them as they stood at the beginning of an uncertain future. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the damaged streets, the watchman once again took his place atop the northern wall. He watched as the Visigoths prepared their wagons, loading the supplies they had taken. Their departure was not rushed. It was measured, deliberate. They would leave Rome behind, but they would carry with them the memory of what they had seen, a city magnificent in strength and fragile in collapse. The watchman exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. He had witnessed the fall. He had seen the city burn. He had walked through the aftermath. Now, standing above Rome once more, he felt something unexpected, an ember of resilience stirring in his chest. Rome stood wounded, but it stood. And tomorrow, he thought, the people would rise with the sun and begin again. Because that is what Rome had always done, even in its darkest hours. As the evening shadows stretched across the broken city, a cool breeze drifted through the streets of Rome, gently lifting ash from the stones and carrying it upward in faint swirls. The city breathed slowly, as though every street and every ruin inhaled and exhaled with the same exhausted rhythm shared by its people. For many survivors, the shock of the sack was beginning to settle into something else, an uneasy blend of grief, numbness, and the earliest stirrings of resilience. They had lived through the unimaginable, and now they stood on the threshold of what came after, unsure of what direction to face. Near the center of the city, Livia sat beside a fountain whose waters had finally begun to clear. She dipped her hands into the cool pool and watched small ripples spread across the surface. The sight brought her a fragile sense of peace. Around her, people gathered in small groups, sharing bits of food or information they had heard, rumors of which senators had survived, which buildings remained, whether the emperor even knew what had happened. Some believed messengers would be sent immediately. Others doubted that anyone outside Rome would understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Rome was supposed to be unshakable, unbreakable, eternal. And yet here they were, living through proof that even the greatest things can fall. One of the older senators approached the fountain cautiously. His robe was torn, and his once proud posture had softened into a stoop. He lowered himself onto a nearby stone bench and let his hands rest on his knees. Livia glanced over, recognizing him from the Senate house. He noticed her gaze and offered a tired smile. "We always believed this city carried the weight of the world," he said quietly. "Perhaps we forgot it was built by human hands." Livia nodded, uncertain how to respond. The senator looked around at the gathering crowd and added, "But people endure, empires do not." His words settled heavily between them, but beneath the sorrow in his voice, there was also a faint echo of acceptance. Farther down the street, Marcus the librarian sat with several young men who had helped him collect his rescued scrolls. They were sorting them carefully, brushing away dust and ash and laying them in the shade to prevent further damage. Marcus spoke softly as he worked, recounting lines from some of the texts the scrolls contained, passages about heroism, fate, and the impermanence of life. The young men listened, drawn to the comforting rhythm of his voice. Marcus did not preach hope, nor did he dwell on despair. He simply shared pieces of Rome's memory, as if to remind those around him that the past was not lost as long as someone remembered it. Outside the city walls, the Visigoths were also preparing for what came next. Their camp, once a temporary settlement of tents, fires, and wagons, was becoming more orderly as they packed supplies and readied themselves to move. Children played between the tents, chasing each other with sticks, their laughter carrying across the field. Warriors examined their weapons, sharpened blades, and discussed the route they would take. Some talked about heading south. Others spoke of trying to reach fertile territories farther west. They were people who had wandered for decades, people who had known hunger, cold, and fear. Rome had been a temporary refuge for them, a place to gather strength before moving on. Alaric stood at the center of the camp, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. His posture was tall, but there was a heaviness in the way his shoulders curved slightly forward. He listened to his commanders debate their next move, but he remained silent, lost in thought. The sack of Rome had given his people what they needed: supplies, leverage, and a message to the empire that the Visigoths could not be dismissed or mistreated. Yet Alaric knew they could not stay. Rome was wounded, but it was still a city of immense complexity, a place his people did not fully understand and could not claim without provoking endless war. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the years ahead. His people needed a homeland, a place where they could settle without being driven out or exploited. He had hoped Rome might offer that, but now he saw that the path lay elsewhere. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was clear. They would move south, toward the rich lands of Campania, where food was plentiful and resistance would be weaker. It would not be easy, but it would be a beginning. Back inside Rome, the day gradually shifted into late afternoon. The golden light washed over the damaged buildings, revealing details the earlier haze had hidden. The ruins looked softer in this light, less harsh, as though the sun were kindly refusing to illuminate their full devastation. People moved more slowly now, their bodies tired but their spirits beginning to adjust. Some gathered at the Tiber to wash away the soot that clung to their skin. Others repaired makeshift shelters or tended to relatives who had been injured during the chaos. Near the riverbank, children knelt beside the water, skipping stones and watching as the ripples spread in widening circles. Their laughter rang out again, brighter this time, and their parents watched with bittersweet smiles. Life was returning in small ways. Even grief had softened slightly, settling into a quiet ache rather than sharp despair. As the sun lowered, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, a group of musicians returned to the riverbank where they had played the day before. Their instruments were battered, and some strings had snapped during the night's events, but they repaired what they could and began to play a slow, gentle melody. The sound drifted across the water and into the city, carried by the breeze like a balm on wounded hearts. People paused in their work to listen. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered along to the familiar tune. Marcus, hearing the music from a distance, smiled faintly and hummed the melody under his breath. Livia paused her sorting and allowed the sound to wash over her. It reminded her of festivals in better days, when musicians filled the forum and families gathered late into the night to celebrate. She felt her throat tighten, but she did not cry. Instead, she breathed deeply and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Lucius, walking along the edge of the river searching for any sign of his family, stopped when he heard the music. It tugged at something deep in his memory, a memory of his mother singing softly while kneading dough, of his sister clapping her hands to the rhythm, of his father tapping the table in time with the beat. For a moment, He closed his eyes and let the warmth of that memory steady him. When he opened them again, he felt a faint spark inside him, not hope exactly, but something close to it. He would find his family. He had to. The day eased into evening, and a soft glow spread across the city as lanterns were lit one by one. The people of Rome moved with a quiet determination now, their movements slower but more deliberate. They no longer flinched at every noise, no longer looked over their shoulders with wide, frantic eyes. The shock had passed. What remained was the beginning of acceptance. High above the city, the watchman took his place once more on the northern wall. He looked out at the Visigoth camp and saw them preparing to leave. The fires were smaller now, the wagons packed more tightly. Warriors moved with purpose, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. The watchman felt a long breath leave his body. The invaders were going. Rome, battered and humbled, had survived. As night returned, the moon rose once more over Rome. This time its light fell on a city that had changed, and yet a city that refused to disappear. It was not the end. It was the beginning of what would come next. That night, as the moon rose quietly over Rome, the city felt strangely different from the night before. The fear was still there, woven into every street and every whisper, but it was no longer sharp or consuming. Instead, it settled into a deep ache, an ache that touched every person who had survived the fall. The fires had died. The screams had faded. What remained was the soft rustling of the night breeze through broken homes and the distant murmur of survivors speaking in low, exhausted voices. A gentle stillness had returned, the kind that comes after a storm, when the world is too tired to move quickly. Down by the river, the fishermen who had gathered earlier sat in a circle around a small fire. Their faces were shadowed by the flickering flames, and their hands were clasped tightly together as they spoke about rebuilding, about fishing nets that needed mending, about the quiet hope that tomorrow would bring calmer waters. One fisherman told a story about a time when the river had flooded, sweeping away homes along its banks. "We rebuilt then," he said softly. "We can rebuild now." His companions nodded, drawing comfort from his words, even if they did not fully believe them yet. Nearby, a handful of Roman soldiers sat with their backs against a fallen column, their armor dented and stained. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing memories of battles, some lost, some won, and the pride they once felt wearing Rome's colors. One soldier, a veteran with gray at his temples, stared out toward the dark horizon and said, "I always thought I'd die defending Rome. I never thought I'd live to see her fall." His voice trembled slightly, and the younger soldiers fell silent. After a moment, one of them placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did defend her," he said quietly. "We all did, but Rome wasn't lost in one night. It had been slipping away for a long time." In the heart of the city, the Forum lay in dim shadow, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering between broken columns. Livia remained there long after most others had gone to rest. She sat on the floor beside her stack of documents, gently flattening each parchment and weighing down the corners so they would dry properly. The repetitive motion soothed her mind, giving her something tangible to focus on. Every so often she looked up at the ruins around her, the empty Senate house, the cracked statues of gods and emperors, the toppled pedestals that once held symbols of Roman pride. She whispered to herself, "Words survive, stories survive." She had copied countless texts in her career, and now she felt a strange sense of purpose. If she could preserve even a handful of these pages, then perhaps Rome would not fully disappear. Perhaps its memory could remain alive through her hands. At the same time, Marcus lay beneath the open sky in the courtyard beside his scrolls. The stars above seemed clearer tonight, as though the smoke had finally lifted enough for their full brilliance to shine through. He gazed at them with the soft, tired eyes of someone who had lived a long life and seen many cycles of rise and fall. The constellations danced faintly, shimmering like ancient messengers telling silent stories. Marcus listened, not with his ears, but with his heart. He felt strangely close to something eternal tonight, something beyond Rome, beyond empires, beyond the fragility of human memory. "You have seen it all," he whispered to the sky. "War, peace, glory, decline, and now this." He closed his eyes. What a privilege it is to have witnessed so much. Across the city, Lucius wandered into the neighborhood where he had grown up. His feet moved slowly over the uneven cobblestones, and each step felt heavier than the last. He passed the bakery where he used to buy warm bread with his sister. The wooden sign lay broken on the ground. He passed the small square where he had played with friends as a child. A portion of the fountain had collapsed. When he reached the building where his family lived, he paused, inhaling deeply before stepping inside. The room was empty. The lamps were gone, the blankets were missing, but there were signs, small signs, that his family had left quickly rather than being taken or harmed. A clay bowl sat upright on the table, not shattered. His sister's sandals were missing, meaning she had taken them with her. A jar of honey, his mother's favorite, had been removed from its shelf. Lucius sank to his knees and let out a shaking breath. They were alive. Somewhere they were alive. A wave of emotion crashed over him, relief, fear, joy, sorrow, all mixing together in a way that overwhelmed him. He sat there in the quiet room for a long time, letting tears fall freely. When he finally stood again, the weight on his chest had lightened. He stepped outside and looked up at the sky. "I'll find you," he whispered. "I promise." Alaric walked slowly among his people, offering a word here, a nod there. He felt a deep responsibility for them, people who had followed him across mountains, through storms, into battle, always holding onto the hope that he would lead them somewhere safe. He knew they could not remain at Rome's gates. They needed land of their own, a place where they would no longer be wanderers. His goal had never been to destroy Rome, but to force Rome to treat his people with dignity. Now, standing in the glow of the moonlight, he wondered whether the message had been understood, or whether it had been drowned in the chaos of fire and fear. He paused on a hill overlooking the city. From there he could see the rooftops, the broken columns, the flickering lanterns of survivors. Rome looked different in the moonlight, less like an invincible empire, more like a resting giant wounded in battle. Alaric felt no joy in its suffering. He felt only a solemn acknowledgement that the world had changed. He whispered a quiet prayer in his own tongue, a prayer not for victory, but for wisdom as he led his people toward whatever came next. Hours later, just before dawn, a soft mist settled over the city. It drifted through alleyways, rose from the river, and curled gently around the bases of statues and columns. The mist softened everything it touched, hiding the sharp edges of broken stones and burned beams. It made the ruins look almost peaceful, like a city caught between worlds, between what it had been and what it would one day become. Livia woke early and stood beneath the portico of the Forum, watching the mist swirl. She felt strangely calm, her mind clearer than it had been in days. She imagined Rome rebuilding slowly, not into the city it had once been, but into something new. Something shaped by loss, yet strengthened by endurance. She imagined children growing up with stories of the sack not as a moment of shame, but as a reminder of the fragility of power and the resilience of people. Lucius, waking near the riverbank, felt a similar clarity. The discovery in his childhood home had reignited his determination. He would search the surrounding countryside, villages, and farms until he found his family. Rome had fallen, but they had survived, and as long as they lived, he would not give up. Marcus woke to the sound of distant bells, rung by priests who had survived the chaos. The tone was soft, almost hesitant, but it traveled far across the quiet city. The sound lifted Marcus's heart. Bells meant order. Bells meant faith. Bells meant continuity. He gathered his scrolls, tied them carefully with frayed cords, and prepared to bring them to a safer place. Knowledge, he believed, was a foundation on which Rome could rebuild. As dawn finally broke, casting warm golden light across the mist-covered city, Alaric gave the final command to his people. The Visigoths began to move slowly at first, then in steady waves through the northern gate and out into the countryside. Their wagons creaked, their horses snorted, their boots pressed into the soft earth. They carried supplies, treasures, and memories. Some looked back at the city as they left. Others faced forward, ready for a new beginning. Rome did not watch them with hatred. Rome watched them with weary understanding. The empire had fallen not because of one enemy, but because of many years, years of neglect, of arrogance, of decisions that placed pride above wisdom. The Visigoths had simply arrived at the end of a long decline, and now, as they departed, they left behind a city that would never be the same. But Rome still stood. It stood in silence, in smoke, in soft rays of morning light. It stood because the people within it stood. The sun climbed higher over Rome, lifting the morning mist and revealing the city in clearer detail, its wounds, its scars, and the small signs of life returning in pockets throughout the streets. Smoke no longer billowed from rooftops, though thin trails still curled upward from places where embers smoldered beneath collapsed beams. Birds cautiously returned, circling above the forum and landing on the tops of statues that had survived the chaos. Their gentle chirping added a fragile sense of normalcy to the air, as if nature were slowly reclaiming space from the remnants of fear. Families who had hidden through the night emerged into the light, blinking as though they were waking from a long nightmare. Some clutched bags of belongings. Others carried children still half asleep in their arms. They looked around as if seeing Rome for the first time, its once familiar streets now transformed into something both recognizable and foreign. People walked carefully, stepping around fallen stones and scattered debris, calling out for relatives or neighbors. When they found someone they knew, they embraced tightly, relief washing over them like a tide. In a narrow street not far from the river, an elderly couple slowly made their way toward their home, leaning heavily on each other for support. Their steps were small, cautious, but determined. When they turned the corner and saw their doorway still intact, tears streamed down the woman's cheeks. Inside, the table was overturned and a few shelves had collapsed, but the structure had survived. It was enough. They set to work immediately, righting the furniture, sweeping the ash, restoring whatever small pieces of their life still remained. Their quiet persistence echoed throughout the neighborhood, as others nearby began doing the same. Livia, after spending hours tending to her documents, walked through the city with careful steps. She moved from home to home, asking if anyone had parchment, ink, or writing tools she could salvage. Many shook their heads regretfully, but a few brought out small ink pots or quills they had managed to save. She accepted each item gratefully, explaining that she hoped to gather the surviving records and preserve them in one place, so that future generations would know what Rome had endured. Her dedication inspired some to join her. Before midday, a small group of men and women followed her from house to house, helping search for scrolls, books, and fragments of text scattered among the ruins. Meanwhile, Lucius traveled farther along the outskirts, following faint trails he hoped might lead to his family. He stopped at small farms and huts beyond the city gates, asking if anyone had seen a family matching his description. Some had seen groups fleeing during the night, but they could not say whether his family was among them. Still, each answer rekindled a spark of hope. He was not too late. They were moving. They were alive. As he walked, he passed a grove of olive trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. The leaves shimmered in the sunlight like tiny silver coins, and for a moment he paused to breathe in the quiet beauty of the scene. It reminded him of days when he had walked these paths with his father, carrying baskets of olives back into the city. The memory was sharp, vivid, almost painful. But instead of breaking him, it strengthened his resolve. He would keep searching, no matter how far he had to go. Back inside Rome, the day warmed and life stirred more noticeably. Bakers gathered near what remained of their ovens, examining the damage and discussing how soon they might resume their craft. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but beneath it came the faint scent of freshly baked bread from one shop that had managed to salvage enough flour to produce a few small loaves. People lined up, waiting patiently for even the smallest piece. When the baker passed out bread still warm from the hearth, many wept quietly at the familiar comfort of the taste, simple, nourishing, ordinary in the best possible way. In the forum, several priests stepped forward with a determination that surprised many who watched. They began cleaning the temples, lifting fallen stones, clearing debris, placing toppled statues back onto makeshift pedestals. Their robes were dusty, torn, and stained, but their hands moved with purpose. One priest knelt in front of a broken altar and carefully arranged the remaining fragments of a shattered offering bowl. When a group of children approached timidly, the priest smiled and invited them to help. Together, THEY Chinese letter stones swept the steps and carried away ashes from burned offerings. The temple may never be fully restored, but in those small acts of reverence, faith found a new foothold. Alaric rode near the middle of the procession, his posture upright despite the strain of the last few days. As the walls of Rome receded behind him, he took one last look at the city. The sun illuminated the rooftops, making even the damaged structures gleam faintly. In that moment, he felt no triumph or regret, only the deep understanding that his people's future lay elsewhere. Rome had been a turning point, not a destination. He whispered a brief farewell, a prayer in his native tongue for peace and guidance, and then he turned his horse toward the road ahead. Inside Rome, people gradually began to reclaim their routines, though nothing felt familiar anymore. Merchants inspected the remains of their stalls, deciding what could be rebuilt. Families who had lost their homes sought shelter with neighbors or relatives. In some districts, people gathered in open squares to share food and stories. They exchanged information about lost loved ones, offered comfort to those grieving, and made plans for the days ahead. Despite the pain and the fear, a shared sense of unity slowly formed, born not from strength, but from vulnerability. The people of Rome understood now, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that their identity did not come from their walls or their monuments. It came from their ability to endure. By late afternoon, the sun cast long beams of light through the remains of the Forum, illuminating motes of dust that floated gently in the air. The city looked almost peaceful from a distance, the ruins softened by the warm glow. Birds perched on fallen columns. A dog barked lightly somewhere in the distance. Life, in its quiet persistence, was returning. Near the river, the musicians gathered again, this time joined by a few Romans who brought makeshift instruments crafted from salvaged materials. The music that followed was imperfect, raw, filled with the weight of everything the city had been through, but it also carried an undercurrent of hope. People stopped to listen, forming a small crowd. Some swayed gently. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered prayers or soft words of gratitude. And then something remarkable happened. A young girl, her face smudged with ash but her eyes bright, stepped forward and began to sing. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, unsure. But within moments it grew stronger, rising above the music and echoing across the riverbank. The song she sang was a simple one, a lullaby her mother had taught her, a lullaby many in the crowd recognized. Slowly, voices joined hers, first a few, then dozens, then more. The melody filled the air, weaving through the ruins, binding the survivors together in one fragile, beautiful moment. For the first time since the sack, the city did not feel broken. It felt alive. As dusk settled over Rome once more, a gentle glow spread across the streets. Lanterns flickered to life in scattered windows. Flames danced in small cooking fires. And the people, tired but united, began preparing for another night. A night without the Visigoths at their gates. A night where the future, though uncertain, held the possibility of rebuilding, of healing, of hope. Livia walked toward the riverbank and watched the scene unfold. Her heart swelled as she listened to the voices rising into the night sky. She whispered softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "Rome still lives." Marcus, hearing the song from afar, closed his eyes and smiled. He believed it too. Lucius stood at the edge of the crowd, hands clasped tightly at his sides. He thought of his family, where they might be, what they might be doing in that moment. He imagined them safe. He imagined them hearing this same melody somewhere under the same sky. He promised himself he would find them, no matter how far he had to go. Up on the northern wall, the watchman listened as well. The song carried all the way to his post. It made him straighten his back and breathe deeply. Rome had fallen, yes, but Rome had not died. The stars began to appear one by one overhead, glittering like tiny torches in the velvet sky. They watched silently as the city below, bruised and battered, found its voice again. The song lingered long after the music stopped. Whispering through alleyways, echoing over the river, weaving itself into the stones of the eternal city. Rome was still Rome, changed, wounded, but alive. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting its soft, golden light across the surviving rooftops and broken stones of Rome. It was the second dawn since the sack, yet this sunrise felt different from the last. There was no thick haze obscuring the sky, no acrid smoke burning in the lungs. Instead, the breeze carried a faint coolness, almost refreshing, as though the air itself had decided to give Rome a moment of reprieve. The light illuminated the ruins in a gentle glow, revealing details that had been hidden in the darkness: fractured columns, scorched mosaics, shattered statues whose faces had been cracked but still looked upward toward the heavens. People stirred earlier today, not because they weren't afraid, but because something inside them, something old and instinctive, urged them to move, to rebuild, to attempt to reclaim the rhythm of life. Survivors stepped outside their homes, or what remained of them, and surveyed their surroundings with clearer eyes. The chaos of the sack had faded into memory, leaving only the quiet determination of a city beginning to rebuild itself one breath at a time. She rose and walked to the center of the forum. In the early morning light, everything looked both fragile and astonishingly resilient. Temple columns that had cracked still stood tall. The Senate House, blackened but unbroken, cast a long shadow over the square. Even the shattered statues seemed almost alive, as if they were guardians watching over the city's recovery. Livia gently placed her hand on one of the broken pedestals and whispered, "We are still here." Nearby, Marcus was already awake, sorting through the scrolls with the same meticulous care he had shown the day before. The young helpers who had joined him arrived one by one, carrying more fragments of text they had found during their searches. Some pieces were nearly intact, others were little more than scorched edges and half-legible words, but Marcus accepted each one with gratitude, spreading them out on cloths and inspecting them with patient eyes. "This," he told them softly, "is how history survives, not through stone or walls, but through memory, through words, through the hands of those who refuse to forget." The young people listened intently, feeling a sense of purpose grow within them. They were not soldiers or senators or priests, but they could preserve what little remained of the city's knowledge, and that responsibility made them stand taller. Lucius reached a small settlement just outside the city walls, a cluster of huts that had escaped the worst of the destruction. As he approached, he saw smoke rising from a chimney, children playing in the dirt, and a few women washing clothes by a well. His heart quickened as he scanned the faces, but none belonged to his family. He approached a man carrying a large basket of firewood and asked, "Have you seen a family, a woman, a man, and a young girl, coming this way 2 nights ago?" The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We saw many pass during the chaos," he replied. "I cannot say who exactly. They were frightened, but they were running toward the hills. Many believed the countryside would be safer." Back inside Rome, the day grew warmer and more survivors emerged into the streets. They began forming small work groups, some clearing rubble, others collecting salvageable wood or stone. A few began repairing water channels and fountains so that fresh water could flow more freely. The sound of shovels scraping, of stones shifting, and of low, collaborative voices filled the air. They were rebuilding, not with grand ambition, but with the simple desire to restore order bit by bit. In one part of the city, a father knelt beside the ruined wall of his home and examined a small stone carving that had survived the fire. It was a carving of a laurel wreath, a symbol of victory. His eyes lingered on it before he carefully brushed away the ash and placed it gently in his pocket. It was the only piece of his home he could carry with him, but it was enough. It represented more than victory. It represented perseverance. Elsewhere, a mother gathered her children beneath the shade of a partially standing arch and braided their hair with quiet focus. The simple act, so familiar and tender, brought comfort to them all. When she finished, she kissed the tops of their heads and told them to stay close. Her voice trembled slightly, but her hands remained steady. She refused to let fear shape the coming days. In a small marketplace, merchants began setting up makeshift stalls. They laid out what few goods they had salvaged: vegetables from gardens beyond the city, scraps of cloth, pottery that had survived the fires. Buyers approached hesitantly at first, unsure whether they should barter or save what little they had. But gradually, transactions resumed. A woman traded a handful of beans for a piece of bread. A man exchanged a small jar of oil for a length of rope. These transactions were not just commerce. They were seeds of stability, small proofs that life could function again. Alaric rode near the front of the procession, guiding his people with a firm but thoughtful presence. He knew they would face challenges ahead: hostility, shortages, uncertainty. But he also knew that they carried something from Rome's fall that could not be measured in gold or plunder. They carried the knowledge that even the greatest empires could break, and from that knowledge came both humility and strength. As the day wore on, a soft breeze swept through the countryside, carrying with it faint traces of Rome's smoke and the scent of distant olive groves. Alaric inhaled deeply and whispered to himself, "Now we begin again." In Rome, Marcus finished arranging the last set of scroll fragments on a clean cloth. He stepped back and surveyed the small collection with quiet pride. It was not much compared to the vast library that had been lost, but it was something. A foundation, a beginning. He called over the young helpers and told them stories about each scroll, who had written it, what it meant, why it mattered. His voice was soft, but his words held the weight of wisdom. The young listeners felt the importance of what they were preserving. They were not rebuilding an empire, they were rebuilding memory. Livia, having collected all the writing tools she could find, sat beneath a tree with her new companions. The shade was cool, and the soft rustling of leaves brought a sense of peace. She opened a fresh parchment and began writing, not copying old laws or official speeches, but recording what she had witnessed. The fall of Rome, the fear, the fire, the grief, the resilience. She believed that future generations should know these details, not as myths, but as truth. Her hand moved steadily across the page, and with each sentence she felt her purpose deepen. As evening approached, the city grew quieter once more. People returned to their shelters, sharing small meals, comforting one another, and watching the sky shift from gold to blue to deep purple. The first stars appeared, twinkling softly above the battered rooftops. A few survivors lit lanterns, and the warm glow spread across the streets like a soft blanket, gentle, comforting, familiar. By the riverbank, the musicians returned yet again. Their instruments were growing worn, their hands tired, but they played through the fatigue. Tonight's melody was slower, softer than before, a lullaby for a city learning to breathe again. As the music drifted across the water, people paused to listen, some standing, some sitting, some simply closing their eyes and letting the gentle notes soothe the raw places inside them. Lucius, returning toward the city after following trails outward, heard the music before he saw the lanterns. His feet were dusty, his clothes worn, but his heart felt stronger now that he had a direction. He approached the riverbank and watched the scene quietly. The faces illuminated by the lanterns were weary but peaceful. For the first time since the night of the sack, he allowed himself to sit down and rest. He listened to the music, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply. When the song ended, he whispered into the night, "Tomorrow. I will search again tomorrow." And far above, the watchman stood once more at the northern wall, looking out over the city as the last traces of sunlight faded. He saw the lanterns glowing in clusters. He saw people gathering near fires. He saw life, fragile, flickering, but real. He leaned on his spear and nodded to himself. Rome had fallen, but Rome was not gone. And as long as people gathered beneath the night sky, sharing stories, sharing hope, sharing breath, the spirit of Rome would endure. As the quiet night settled fully over Rome, the city breathed in a slow, steady rhythm, as though gathering strength for the days and years ahead. The lanterns flickered gently in windows, casting warm patches of light across cracked stones and damaged walls. A few torches remained lit near temples and along the riverbank, their flames swaying in the breeze like living reminders that Rome had not been extinguished, only altered. Livia remained awake long after most others had gone to sleep. She sat at the edge of the forum, beneath a half-collapsed arch, with a new piece of parchment spread across her lap. The moon above provided just enough glow for her to write, and she dipped her quill into a small pot of ink she kept tucked in a cloth pouch. Her strokes were slow and deliberate at first, hesitant, as though she feared misrepresenting the enormity of what had happened. But soon her hand steadied and she wrote with a clarity that surprised even her. She wrote of the siege. She wrote of the hunger. She wrote of the fear, the betrayal, the burning night. She wrote of how the gate opened, not with thunderous force but with a quiet, fateful creak. She wrote of the screams and the silence that followed. She wrote of the music by the river, the voices rising in unity, the city remembering how to breathe. Her words flowed like a river, steady, honest, unadorned. She wrote not for the Senate, not for priests, not for the wealthy elite. She wrote for the future, for whoever would someday find her parchment and wonder how Rome had lived through the darkest night in its long history. When she finished the final line, she lifted her eyes to the sky and whispered, "Let someone remember." Then she rolled the parchment and tied it with a string, placing it carefully beside the others she had collected. Each scroll felt like a heartbeat. Each scroll was a memory preserved. Meanwhile, Marcus lay beneath the columns of a ruined portico, gazing up at the stars as though reading them like the texts he loved so dearly. He traced constellations with his finger, naming each one softly: Orion, Hercules, Lyra. The familiar shapes comforted him. Empires rose and fell, but the constellations remained steadfast, shining down on every generation with the same eternal glow. One of his young helpers approached and sat beside him, pulling his tattered cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Master Marcus," the boy whispered, "do you think Rome will ever be what it once was?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "No," he said gently. "Rome will never be what it was, but that does not mean it will be less. It will simply be different. No great city remains unchanged forever. It is the nature of life to shift and evolve." The boy nodded slowly, letting the words settle in his heart. The two of them sat in silence under the night sky, listening to the distant sound of water lapping against the riverbank. Across the countryside, Lucius walked steadily along a dirt road that led toward a cluster of distant farms. The sky above him was vast and glittering, and the air smelled faintly of olive groves and freshly turned soil. His steps were slower now, fatigue tugging at his limbs, but he pushed forward with quiet determination. Every so often he paused to listen, to the wind rustling through the trees, to the hoot of an owl, to the faint chirping of crickets. He wondered if his family could hear the same sounds wherever they were hiding. He imagined them sitting near a fire, speaking softly about him, hoping he was safe. That image carried him onward, step after step. Eventually, he reached a small farmhouse with a lantern burning in the window. He approached cautiously and knocked. A woman with gray hair opened the door, her eyes lined with worry. Lucius explained his search, describing his family and asking if she had seen anyone like them. The woman's face softened with sympathy. "Many have passed this way," she said. "But I remember a man and woman with a girl who looked tired and frightened. They stayed for a short while. They left at dawn yesterday." Back in Rome, the watchman stood again at his post high above the northern wall. It had become a ritual for him these last nights, to stand, to look outward, to observe the horizon for danger or change. But tonight felt different. Tonight he did not watch the fields with dread. He watched them with a sense of wonder. The Visigoths were far away now, their fires tiny pinpoints of light in the distance. Rome was safe, at least for the moment. He turned his gaze inward, looking down at his city. He saw lanterns glowing in clusters. He saw families gathered near fires. He saw survivors who had chosen to remain awake, speaking softly about what they had endured. He saw children sleeping soundly, curled beneath blankets. He saw small pockets of order beginning to take shape once more. He whispered into the night, "You are not finished." At the same time, near the riverbank, the last notes of the evening's music faded, and the musicians packed away their instruments. Some returned to their makeshift shelters, while others lingered a little longer, gazing out at the reflection of the moon on the rippling water. A woman with a soft voice began singing a lullaby, one passed down through her family. Others joined in, their voices blending into a calm, soothing harmony that filled the air like a warm blanket. The song drifted through the streets and up the hills, reaching the ears of anyone still awake. For those who heard it, the melody eased the tension in their hearts. It reminded them of childhood, of safety, of gentler times. It reminded them that even after horror, beauty could still exist. Livia heard the song as she gathered her parchments. She placed them carefully into a basket, then walked slowly toward the riverbank to listen more closely. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her hair gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and allowed the music to wrap around her like a comforting embrace. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She felt the fragile unity that had formed among the survivors, a bond created not by wealth or status, but by shared endurance. Marcus, hearing the melody from afar, wiped at his eyes, moved by the simple power of voices joined together. He whispered, "We endure because we remember." Even Lucius, far from the city and walking alone beneath the moonlit sky, heard echoes of the song carried by the wind. He paused, listening with closed eyes, letting the faint melody guide his steps. He felt the warmth of Rome's spirit inside him, even as he searched the world beyond its walls. Eventually, the song quieted, replaced by the soft hum of nighttime. One by one, survivors drifted into sleep, curled beneath blankets, cloaks, or whatever coverings they could find. The musicians rested their weary hands. The priests extinguished temple torches. The soldiers laid down their weapons and closed their eyes. Even the watchman allowed himself a brief moment of rest, leaning against the battlement with his eyes half closed. And Rome slept. Not deeply, not without fear, but peacefully enough for healing to begin. Above the city, the stars shone brightly, forming ancient patterns that had guided sailors, shepherds, and dreamers for centuries. They cast their silver light upon the ruins, upon the survivors, upon the river that wound like a quiet ribbon through the heart of the city. They shone upon a world that was changing. They shone upon a city that refused to disappear. They shone upon the beginning of a new chapter, for Rome was no longer the capital of an empire, but it was still Rome, and in the soft embrace of the night, it dreamed of what it might become next. Morning came slowly, with a pale light spreading across the horizon and spilling gently into the battered streets of Rome. The sky above shifted from deep indigo to soft lavender, and then finally to the warm gold of dawn. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust, but also something unfamiliar, something clean, almost new. For the first time since the sack, the city felt like it was waking not from a nightmare, but into the fragile promise of a new beginning. Livia rose early, her hair tied loosely behind her, her eyes still heavy with sleep but her mind sharp with purpose. She gathered her scrolls and tools and made her way toward the Senate House, where she hoped to find a quiet place to begin sorting the records she and her small group had collected. The building, though damaged, still stood with an almost stubborn strength. The marble walls blackened but intact, the tall columns cracked but unmoving. She stepped inside carefully, her sandals scraping against the stone floor, and felt a shiver of awe. Even in ruin, the Senate House felt sacred. Elsewhere in the city, Marcus stood on the steps of a ruined temple, stretching his stiff limbs and inhaling deeply. He had slept poorly, but the sight of the rising sun filled him with a calm sense of purpose. The young helpers soon arrived, carrying new fragments they had collected at dawn. Marcus greeted them warmly and praised their dedication. One of the boys held out a nearly intact scroll he had found hidden under a collapsed beam. "It's a speech," the boy said proudly. "I think from a senator." Marcus examined the scroll, his eyes widening with delight. "This," he said, "is more than a speech. It is a piece of Rome's heart." The young listeners exchanged glances, their chests swelling with pride. They were building something that would outlast them, something beautiful, something important. They were restoring Rome not with stone, but with knowledge. As he passed two shepherds tending their flocks, he paused to ask once more about a man, a woman, and a young girl. One shepherd tilted his head thoughtfully and said, "We did see a family pass by yesterday morning. They were frightened, but the girl, she had a ribbon in her hair, a red one." Lucius felt his heart stop. A red ribbon. His sister had worn one every day since their mother had given it to her. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed with relief, and thanked the shepherds. When he opened his eyes again, tears shimmered at the edges, but his voice was steady. "Thank you. You've given me more hope than you know." He walked on with renewed strength, almost breaking into a run as he followed the direction they had indicated. Back in Rome, groups of survivors gathered in the streets to distribute food and water. The work was slow but steady. People formed lines, handing out fruit from the countryside, bread from the few remaining bakers, and water drawn from the least damaged fountains. Many shared freely, giving what little they had to those with even less. Compassion spread through the city like a quiet rhythm, uniting people who might never have spoken to one another before the fall. In one neighborhood, a young mother knelt beside her son, washing soot and ash from his face with careful, gentle strokes. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming tenderness she felt knowing he had survived. Her son giggled as the cool water touched his cheeks, and his laughter echoed through the ruins like a small but brilliant spark of life. Nearby, an elderly man with trembling hands tied fresh cloth onto a broken cart, turning it into a makeshift stall. He arranged small clay pots, herbs, and dried fruit upon it, calling out softly to passers-by. His voice was raspy but steady. "Take what you need," he said. "Pay only what you can." People approached him hesitantly at first, but soon a small crowd gathered, grateful for the simple offering of kindness. The soldiers who remained in the city gathered near the gates, discussing repairs and strategizing how to defend the city should another threat arise. Their armor glinted faintly in the sun, dented, scratched, but still functional. One soldier, the veteran with gray at his temples, stood with his arms crossed, surveying the horizon. His gaze was no longer filled with despair. Instead, it held a quiet resolve. He said to the younger soldier, "Rome may have lost her walls, but she has not lost her heart." The words resonated with them deeply. They nodded, adjusting their grips on their spears and shields, ready to protect what remained with unwavering loyalty. As the day warmed, children wandered into the forum, chasing each other among the broken columns. Their laughter carried through the square, weaving between the echoes of hammering and sweeping and soothing voices. A small girl stopped near a toppled statue and traced her fingers along its cracked marble surface, whispering something only she could hear. Her mother called her name, and she ran back with tiny, quick steps. Nearby, a group of women sat in the sun mending clothes, patching tears, stitching seams, turning scraps of fabric into something wearable again. They worked with steady hands, their conversations soft and comforting. They spoke of family members they hoped to reunite with, of plans to rebuild their homes, of memories they refused to let fade. They shared stories of their childhoods, their marriages, their joys, their pain, all of it part of the intricate tapestry of a city learning to heal. And then, as the afternoon sunlight mellowed, something unexpected occurred. A group of men discovered a partially intact statue near the Temple of Jupiter. The statue, though missing an arm, still stood tall, its expression serene and dignified. The men gathered around it, clearing debris and lifting fallen stones away from its base. A crowd soon formed, watching as they worked together to stabilize the statue. One of the men stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and said in a trembling voice, "Let this stand as a reminder. Rome bows but does not break." The crowd murmured in agreement, some touching the statue gently, others bowing their heads in reverence. It was not the statue itself that mattered, but what it represented, a symbol that even in ruin hope could be found. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the city and the warm glow of lanterns returned. People gathered for their humble evening meals, sharing bread, fruit, and stories of the day. The musicians once again made their way to the riverbank, sitting in a loose circle with their instruments. Their fingers moved with exhaustion but also with reverence. They played not for entertainment but for healing. Tonight's song was different, gentler than the others, slow and soothing, like a lullaby meant for a weary city. The melody drifted across the river and into the streets, wrapping the survivors in its soft embrace. People paused in their conversations, their work, their thoughts, allowing the music to wash over them. Marcus leaned against a column, eyes closed, absorbing the notes with deep gratitude. Livia sat near the river's edge, hugging her basket of scrolls to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The tears were not of grief, but of release, an unburdening of everything she had held inside. Even Lucius, far from the city but not too far to hear faint echoes carried by the wind, paused to listen. The notes were barely audible, but they reminded him of home. His steps slowed, then quickened again as hope filled him like a breath of fresh air. And high above, on the northern wall, the watchman listened as well, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He no longer feared the silence of the night. He welcomed it. Rome was healing, not all at once, not perfectly, but slowly, gently in its own time. And as the stars emerged overhead, bright, steady, eternal, the city lay beneath them, weary but alive, waiting for the dawn of the next day. A day that would bring change, a day that would bring answers, a day that would move Rome one step further from the shadow of its fall. The next morning began with an unexpected stillness. one that felt deeper, clearer, and more peaceful than any since the sack. Rome lay beneath a soft blanket of early light, the sky tinted gold and rose as dawn stretched across the horizon. The ruins, washed in this gentle brightness, seemed less broken, less frightening. Cracked walls glowed warmly. Fallen stones sparkled with dew, and for the first time in days the city felt almost calm. Livia woke near the Senate house, her head resting lightly on a folded cloak someone had left for her. Her eyes fluttered open, and she lifted her gaze toward the pale morning sky. A sense of quiet clarity washed over her. She rose slowly, stretching her arms, feeling the stiffness of sleep in her bones, but also the renewed strength of purpose blossoming inside her. She gathered her parchments and made her way into the Senate house once again. The building was silent except for the soft echo of her footsteps. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of morning light streaming through cracks in the ceiling. She walked between the tall, darkened columns and knelt in the center of the hall, arranging her scrolls with careful precision. Today, she planned not only to record what had happened, but also to begin copying some of the more fragile fragments before they crumbled completely. She dipped her quill into ink and began writing. The calm of the morning helped her hand move steadily, each stroke preserving one more piece of Rome's memory. Outside, Marcus stood on the temple steps with his young helpers, watching the sunrise. His eyes softened as he admired the golden light illuminating the forum. It reminded him of the early mornings from his youth, when he would rush to open the library before anyone else, eager to lose himself in the world of words. Today, that same eagerness stirred in him. He clapped his hands gently, stirring the group to action. "Today," he said with a warm smile, "we rebuild our library." The children looked at him with wide eyes. A makeshift library, amid ruins, but Marcus simply nodded, his expression full of unwavering certainty. Not grand, not polished, but a place where knowledge can survive. They set to work gathering wooden planks, broken shelves, and intact stones from the surrounding area. Piece by piece, they repurposed the remains of toppled structures into a small area where scrolls could be stored. They created a sheltered space beneath a partially collapsed roof, where shade and protection from rain could keep the most fragile work safe. It was humble, nothing like the vast libraries Rome once held, but it was real and it was theirs. As Marcus placed the first preserved scroll on the new shelf, he felt a tear slip down his cheek, not of sadness, but of pride. The flame of knowledge had not gone out. It had simply moved to new hands, new hearts. Meanwhile, Lucius traveled deeper into the countryside, following the faint trail of footprints and wagon tracks left behind by fleeing families. The path led him through olive groves, past golden fields swaying gently in the breeze, and along winding dirt roads lined with cypress trees. His steps were quicker now, driven by the shepherd's words about the family with the red ribbon. Each mile brought him closer to the possibility of reunion. Around midday, he reached a small cluster of houses built along a ridge overlooking rolling hills. Smoke drifted from one of the chimneys. He approached and asked a farmer working outside if he had seen the family he described. The man nodded thoughtfully. "Yes," the farmer said. "A man, a woman, and a young girl with something red in her hair. They came through yesterday, asking for water. They were heading toward the village by the river." One small boy found a piece of bronze jewelry, a brooch shaped like a leaf, and brought it excitedly to his mother. She turned it over in her hands and smiled. The brooch might have once belonged to someone important, but now it was a token of hope. She pinned it to her cloak, a small sign that beauty could be found even in rubble. A group of priests gathered near the temple of Jupiter and began organizing a ceremony of cleansing and renewal. They lit incense, placed offerings of fruit and bread on damaged altars, and chanted prayers that echoed softly through the forum. People stopped to watch, tears welling in their eyes. The rituals reminded them that faith, like the city, could survive even the darkest of nights. Livia paused outside the Senate house and listened to the prayers drifting through the air. The sound gave her a sense of grounding, as though the city's spirit itself was rising from the ashes. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart beating calmly. Rome lived, not because of buildings or armies, but because of its people, their memories, their voices. As midday grew warmer, Marcus and his helpers completed the first section of their small library. Survivors gathered around, offering any text they had found in their homes or among the ruins. Some brought poems written for loved ones. Others carried ledger pages, philosophical passages, or fragments of letters. Marcus accepted each one with gratitude. He knew that every scrap, every word mattered. Meanwhile, Lucius finally reached the village by the river. His breath quickened as he approached the cluster of houses. He scanned every face, searching desperately for familiar ones. Children played in the street, their laughter echoing lightly. Women carried baskets of laundry. Men mended fishing nets, but he saw no sign of his family. Panic stirred in him for a moment, but a voice behind him broke the tension. "Are you searching for someone?" Lucius turned to see an older woman sitting on a wooden bench. Her eyes were warm, her posture relaxed. He described his family, including the red ribbon in his sister's hair. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "They were here." The girl was frightened. Her mother comforted her. The father looked determined. They left early this morning, heading toward the old road along the river. Lucius exhaled sharply, his entire body trembling with relief. They were alive. They were near. He thanked the woman and sprinted toward the river path, his heart pounding. Every step felt lighter, every breath sharper with anticipation. In Rome, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of amber and pink, the city once again gathered at the riverbank. The musicians took their places in a loose circle, their instruments worn but ready. Tonight's tune began with a soft, tentative melody, slow and contemplative, like a sigh released by thousands of souls at once. People gathered quietly, some sitting, some standing, some holding hands. Marcus approached with several children by his side. Livia stood at the edge of the crowd, her scrolls safely tucked away. The soldiers near the gate listened from a distance. Even the priests paused their rituals to let the music fill the evening air. As the melody rose and fell, it seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the city. Gentle, tired, but steady. Livia closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. In her mind, she saw Rome not as it had fallen, but as it might rise. A city rebuilt by hands that had trembled in fear but now worked with courage. A city no longer defined by its power, but by its resilience. Marcus watched the children listening with wide eyes, their expressions softening as the notes drifted around them. He thought of all the stories he had read in his lifetime, stories of triumph, sorrow, hope, and he realized that they were now living inside such a story. They were the chapters that future generations would read. And on the northern wall, the watchman stood again, as he always did, looking out over the glowing city. He felt the cool breeze against his face, heard the gentle music rising from below, and whispered to himself, "Rome still breathes." Far from the city, Lucius followed the river path until he reached a ridge overlooking the flowing water. The last light of day shimmered on the surface like molten gold. As he descended the slope, he heard faint voices ahead. He slowed, his heart racing, and stepped carefully between two large rocks. And there, sitting beside a small fire near the river, was his family. His mother looked up first. Her eyes widened. Her hands flew to her mouth. His father stood abruptly, dropping a piece of kindling from his hand. His sister turned, the red ribbon still tied in her hair, and gasped as she sprang to her feet. Lucius froze for a moment, overcome with emotion. Then he ran toward them, tears streaming down his face. His mother reached him first, wrapping him in an embrace so tight he could barely breathe. His father placed his hands on Lucius's shoulders, his voice breaking as he said, "We thought you were gone." Lucius shook his head fiercely. "I will never leave you." His sister pressed her face into his chest, sobbing softly. He stroked her hair gently, whispering promises of safety, of love, of the future they would face together. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, the reunited family held each other tightly, their silhouettes blending into the soft glow of the firelight. Rome had fallen, but love had not. And for Lucius, for his family, and for every survivor across the city, that love would be the foundation of the world that came next. As night settled once more over Rome, a soft silver glow washed across the rooftops, broken columns, and warming embers of small fires scattered throughout the city. Stars above shimmered with the same steady light they had given to generations of Romans long before this moment. They bore witness to the rise of an empire, its triumphs and tragedies, and now they watched quietly as the eternal city endured the quiet hours after its darkest trial. Rome had been shaken, humbled, wounded deeply, but it had not been erased. Beneath the vast night sky, the survivors breathed in sync with the city around them, each heartbeat a small but undeniable testament to resilience. Livia stood at the edge of the forum with her basket of carefully preserved scrolls held close to her chest. The wind lifted strands of her hair as she gazed up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace settle through her bones. She knew something had changed within her, something permanent. She had witnessed the fall of a world she had always believed immovable, yet she had also seen the strength that rose afterward. And as she looked at the glowing windows, the flickering lanterns, the shadows of people gathering around shared fires, she whispered a promise to herself and to Rome: memory will survive. She breathed deeply, feeling the night settle around her like a soft cloak. Far beyond the city, Lucius sat beside his reunited family near their small campfire by the river. The flames crackled softly, casting warm light across their faces. His sister rested her head on his shoulder, her red ribbon fluttering in the breeze. His mother stirred a pot of broth over the fire, humming the familiar tune she used to sing while cooking. His father sat close, one arm around Lucius, no longer the stoic pillar he had always been, but a man who knew the priceless grace of survival. Lucius looked at the river flowing past them, glowing gold under the moonlight, and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had feared losing everything, but in the ashes of the fall, he had found what mattered most. Tomorrow they would return to Rome, or perhaps begin anew elsewhere. It did not matter, they were together, and that alone made the future feel wide and open. In the city, musicians once again lifted their instruments, their fingers creating a melody so soft it blended with the quiet whisper of the night wind. The tune spread across the river, over the ruins, into every corner of the city where survivors rested. It was a lullaby for the wounded, a balm for the weary. A gentle reminder that even after devastation, songs can rise, voices can rise, hope can rise. And on the northern wall, the watchman stood for the last time before sunrise, gazing over the sleeping city. His posture relaxed, his heart steady. He whispered into the cool air, "You endure." And as the wind carried his voice across the rooftops, it seemed almost as though the stones themselves answered back, "We always have. We always will." Rome had fallen, but Rome lived. Not through its senators or its armies, not through its monuments or its wealth, but through its stories, through its memory, through the quiet, unbreakable strength of the people who refused to let the light go out. As the final notes of the night's song faded and the first hint of dawn touched the sky, the eternal city rested, battered, humbled, changed forever, yet still breathing beneath the stars. And in that breath, in that fragile, beautiful pause between darkness and light, the future began. If you found comfort in this journey, if you enjoyed this gentle retelling of history, I invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what chapter of history you want to visit next. For tonight, may your mind rest, may your heart be steady, and may your dreams carry you gently into the world of tomorrow. Good night.